Here. All right. Looks like this thing officially turned on. So we're gonna get going in just a minute or two here. Probably lots of noise in the background, so be another minute or two there. I think we can go ahead and get going. If anybody comes in, I'll just say, hey, come on in. Carter. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Having fun with that stuff.
Welcome, good afternoon. So much for joining us. My name is the executive director of the chamber. We get back to get to know all of you, but so glad that you're joining us. I'm really excited about today's lunch and learn presenting this for us. Make money joyful. I know that doesn't always feel like those two much of enjoy to go to hear how they feel. So with that, thank you so much. Today, I'm going to turn it on over so we can learn what they do.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. It's listen to my spiel. Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a topic that oftentimes we think of as being stressful, anxiety provoking. It's you have to sit down and deal with numbers. You have to get really strict with yourself. You have to track every single expense. And I think that there is a better way. So I want to present that to you, show you a little bit about what I do in terms of that with our members. So I am Mark Moore. I'm the community development advocate here at On Tap Credit Union. I do community development through financial education. So oftentimes what that looks like is I will have a lot of our members do what I would call a 6-week program with me. Really what that means is just hop on a call for 30 minutes a week for 6 different weeks, because, when we jump into a lot of this stuff, there is an element of the fact that it's like we can get through a lot in 1 hour or one session. But at the end of the day, this is really an ongoing thing where we do have to integrate it into our lives in some way or another. So it is nice to kind of spread it out over a longer time frame and to be able to start to incorporate some of these ideas as we go. Who is On Top? We are, we're here right now. We started in the 50s as Coors Credit Union. When we rebranded, as many credit unions did, they're becoming a public institution, and a lot of people would come in and say, do you have to work at Coors to be here? And so we went through a rebrand, but we still wanted to maintain that hat tip to our brewery heritage. So you can see our branch reflects that in many ways. Hopefully the goal is to make finances as joyful as a family night at the brewery on Friday night over here at Mountain Toad or at Holiday or at any of our amazing breweries around here. A couple of just credit union phrases. People helping people is the big one. And then not for profit, not for charity, but for service. So a lot of folks don't recognize this, but as credit unions, we are a not-for-profit institution. We're not a nonprofit, but we are also not a for-profit institution. You can see that reflected even in things like our website. It's a .org, not a .com. So that's all I'll say for right now. I'm not going to be trying to pitch anybody too much on what we do. Let's just jump into the topics. Okay, so here's where I like to start. The hero's journey. I think that money is one of those topics where a lot of people get to a place where they wish that they could just offload it to somebody else, have somebody else do it for them and not ever have to think about it. And I am going to start things off with the bad news, which is that it's not that way. Money is not that way. Even in partnerships, we will sometimes see a couple that one person is kind of the money manager. And in my mind, that's kind of similar to the idea of parenting being like, does one person only parent? Like, no. But yet we sometimes think that way with money. So what I hope to convince you of is the fact that for you, like, you are the hero. in your journey. And you have to embrace that, because you can absolutely be your own hero. With that said, as we know in the hero's journey, if we go down the Joseph Campbell track, one of the things that comes up in the hero's journey is there is always some type of, or many, kind and compassionate guides. So I encourage you to find those people. I like to think of myself as being one of those kind and compassionate guides that can help you along that hero's journey. But there is an element of, you do have to take a little bit of ownership and take control. I like to highlight this pyramid of financial awesomeness, which this is from Paco de Leon's book called Finance for the People. It is a great book. Highly recommend that folks check it out and read it. I really like her path here. And basically what she says is you're going to start at the bottom of the pyramid, and you're going to go across to the right until you finish the bottom row, and then you're going to jump up. And you can see, if you go through and read all of these things, they're all great things to dive into. And yet, at the same time, we're not necessarily going to follow that exact track today. I'm going to take a little bit of a bigger picture view. And the goal for today is really to give us a view of the playing field. I think oftentimes we get so focused, especially in finance, on some of the things that are micro. We get stuck in the weeds a little bit. And being able to step back and see the whole playing field just to even get started, I find to be a fantastic place to get started. So with that said, the step number one for me is this. So I'll give you a little bit more of my background before I kind of dive into this. I was a high school math teacher for 9 years. I was college educated, and so what happened is I was teaching second semester seniors, and we all know how second semester seniors kind of get to the point where you hear the phrase, when am I ever going to use this? And as a teacher, you're like, I will overcome that. And so I created this, originally what was just a bunch of financial problem sets using Excel, because Excel is the math that we use in the modern world. And again, as a college educated person myself, as I kept diving more and more into this idea of teaching a financial literacy course, I got to the place where I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't know anything myself. And it's not my fault either. Our society does not have a high school class on personal finance. We don't teach this stuff at all. And so for me as a math teacher, I got to the point where I was felt very confident in my personal finance. And yet I also still had some pieces missing. And I think really what those pieces were is, as a math teacher, I just wanted to put up this beautiful compounding interest spreadsheet. Doesn't that make you want to dive into your finances? And it's no, we're human beings, right? It starts here. It starts here in a totally different place than with the numbers or with compounding interest. That's not what gets us excited about taking ownership of our finances. Because at the end of the day, as human beings, I think oftentimes we think that if we change the thoughts in our head, it'll change our actions. And it turns out that we have a layer in between thought and action, and that's feeling and emotion. And so how do we actually get to the place where we are inspired to take that action, to make some changes? And so that's really where it starts for me, is understanding our own money psychology. At the end of the day, we live in society. So it's not just it's that we will all come to money from a different perspective, right? And it's not just, did I grow up poor? Did I grow up rich? I could have been anywhere along that spectrum of income, and I could still see money, just for example, as the root of all evil, the thing that makes people do unethical things, right? Or I could have grown up in an entrepreneurial family, and I could see money as the value exchange that I get when I do good in the world. That's a very different way of looking at the same thing, which is ultimately just a tool that can help to get us where we want to go, right? And yet also money is more than just a tool, because we start to think through the tools that we use. When I use an Excel spreadsheet, that starts to fundamentally change the way that I structure data in my head before I actually put it onto the spreadsheet. And money does the same thing, right? So we can say, oh, money is just a tool, but we also have to recognize that tools are never neutral. So this is kind of where I will start things. Carl Jung, one of my favorite psychologists of all time. And he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. So to begin, we have to start by asking, like, what is my perspective on money? How do I approach this to begin with? And just to give you a quick example, like, I don't want to go into a full thesis here of the ways that we think, but just to give you a quick example of some of the ways that we think and what this is speaking to, we'll do a quick activity just to get things started here. So what you're going to do is do a visualization with me. You're going to pretend that you're getting in your car and you are driving out of your neighborhood. So you can even close your eyes, put your hands on the steering wheel, and you're going down the first road in your neighborhood, get to that first stop sign, look up and to the right at that stop sign. What color is that stop sign? You can just yell it out and you can open your eyes. What did I hear? Red. Stop signs are red. Now you're going to see that I am playing a little bit of a trick on you here. We'll get to the real meat of it soon. But stop signs are red and white. Okay? See where I'm getting here. Okay, we'll get to the real heart of it first, but I got one more little warm up for you before we get there. You're gonna get back in your car, keep driving, and this time you are driving down the road, you see a yield sign over to the right. Yell it out. What colors is that yield sign? Does everybody think it's red and white? Yellow and black versus red and white. Which is it? Chris was already on to me here. Because yield signs are red and white. What most people will do in this circumstance is they'll yell out yellow and black. Why? Because I just primed you. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So what happens to us is we cannot analyze every single piece of information at all times in order to come to the decision that most maximizes our economic utility. Like, no, we create mental shortcuts. What Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky called heuristics. That's a whole nother rabbit hole that I get really nerdy and into. But basically, they created this field called behavioral economics. And they said, hey, we don't analyze every single piece of data. We create these mental shortcuts. And they started to identify a few of them. So this is one of them, the availability heuristic. And that's me priming you, right? I put all of these other caution signs around the stop sign. And so our brains create that mental shortcut where we're like, oh, a stop sign's red and white, but all the other ones, those are all yellow and black. Yellow and black, even though if we stopped and thought about it, yield signs are red and white. So there are a lot of these subconscious and unconscious programs that are operating at all times that help us to make decisions. And so basically what we're doing in this is we're starting to uncover some of the ways that we naturally think, and we're going to start questioning, like, is that true or is it not? Could I take a different perspective on this particular issue? So some of the questions that we'll often ask here is like, and a lot of you can think about this and reflect on it for yourselves, is what was money like for you growing up? What are the first 3 words that come to mind? What lessons do you think you took away growing up the way you did with money? Do you think everybody in the world took away those same lessons? Is it possible to adapt and mold the lessons that you've learned for your own lifestyle in today's world? That's kind of the first step. This is something that I find to be really interesting is this guy, Dr. Brad Klons, coined the term invisible money scripts. And basically what this is these are some of those scripts that are running underneath the surface when we're going about our daily lives. So if I grew up believing or hearing the phrase, money doesn't grow on trees, like it's much more likely that I'm going to come to money from the perspective of feeling like I need to restrict myself. I need to have this kind of control. And if I'm not hitting it, then I might be more like mad at myself, right? I might try to avoid money more. If let's see, money changes people is another good one. It's like, yeah, of course money changes people. Like, and that can change us in really good ways. It can make us more generous. It can make it, so a lot of these things are some of the things that run underneath the surface. You don't get to that level of wealth without making a few shady deals here and there. Well, that's what I alluded to earlier. And there's a number of different perspectives that people can take, right? But that one, you don't get to that level of wealth without a few shady deals here or there, or money is the root of all evil. That one comes up commonly. And we start to ask, like, well, how is that going to have me interact with money if that is what I believe about it? Is that true? If you believe that student loans are a scam, and like, don't get me wrong, I have my own beliefs on student loans, and especially in this country where we have legislatively made it such that they do not get erased even by bankruptcy. Like, mind-boggling. And yet, if you believe that, it's likely that you're going to say, well, I'm going to take those student loans to my grave. And because they don't get erased, you literally will. And for me, I'm like, that's too small a life for you. Like, we can put this plan together, pay them off, and move on. Like, that's how we should go about doing it. So this is kind of the place where oftentimes we'll have a lot of these types of conversations just to begin with. And the step number 2 here is what happens if nothing changes? Because at the end of the day, people have to have a reason to care about money. That's that kind of feeling that I was alluding to earlier. So some of this will come up as, some of these questions here. What happens if nothing changes? What is the cost of your beliefs? And I don't want to go on too long of a tangent here either. Watch me, I will. But when we ask, what happens if nothing changes? Oh, I got to figure out how to make this go away also. But when we ask, what happens if nothing changes? For some people, it's like, it's drastic, it's dire. Like, I need to make a change right now. But for a lot of us, it's like, I don't know. Go on kind of living the life that I'm living right now. Things are good. I'm not really thinking about retirement or anything like that way down the line. But I submit that there is often this like kind of little bit of anxiety that follows us around at all times. And what happens if you multiply that out by 25 years or 30 years, always feeling a little bit anxious about the way that things are going? And so I think for me, like, that's a reason right there. Like, let's put some time in it and take control of this right now. Step number 3 is to envision what our lives could look like. And I like to say this is our rich lives are not like our rich lives, they're rich life that we can live. So envisioning specifically what we want things to look like is kind of gives us that vision and that motivation to then dive into the next stage, which is, of course, finally the numbers. Before we get there, I'll show you this. People often ask, like, well, but at the end of the day, there is constraints with money, right? Of course. Like, we're not going to just, click our heels and spin in a circle 3 times and say, rich life, and just like get a Ferrari or something like that, right? There are constraints at the end of the day. But what I hope to be able to do here is to get very intentional about the things that we choose to spend our money on so that we can, and this is a quote actually from this guy, Ramit Sethi, who's awesome also, another great financial guru out there, so that we can spend extravagantly on the things that we love, so long as we cut costs mercilessly on the things that we don't. So I'll talk a little bit about what that can mean when we get into the conscious cash flow system, just to give some examples. But before we get there, I'll talk a little bit about money lenses and money dials. So money lenses, there are a bunch of them out there, but basically money lenses would be the perspective that I take when I go into any individual purchase or when I'm thinking about using money in any way. So the lens that most commonly we use in America is this one, is the lens of cost, which can be perfectly reasonable, but it can also be limiting. And what I hope to eventually get folks to think about is actually applying different lenses at different times in your life for different situations. So what I mean by that is there's a number of different lenses listed up here. Value is one of them, right? Warren Buffett said cost is what you pay, value is what you get. There are times that I think all of us have recognized that value is the lens that I wanted to use in this regard, because yeah, some product might be really cheap, but it's gonna break in 2 days and I'm gonna have to just buy another one anyway. So quality does matter. But there are a number of other different lenses that we can apply. You can see security can be a lens that I can use to value my money. Delight is another one. Convenience or speed is a big one that comes up. And the thing that I think is a very simple example to give here is if I have acquired somehow, at this point in my life, I have acquired $1 million. And part of the reason that I say this is because this will be many of us. Like, you will reach a level of wealth at some point, especially if you can adapt a system similar to the one that I recommend, but adapted for your purposes. You will acquire a certain amount of wealth. And everybody thinks that when I hit some number, the way I think about money will change. And that's not true. Like, the way we feel about money is highly uncorrelated with how much of it we have. And so if I have this person who has $1 million and they're going around applying the lens of cost to everything, that means that they're applying the lens of cost to a home purchase, to a car purchase, and to buying berries at Whole Foods versus Costco versus King Soopers, right? And at some point, it does not make sense for somebody with a certain amount of wealth to be driving all across town to be saving $5 or $3 on that set of berries when you can also focus on the, instead of the $3 question, the $30,000 question of what car you end up choosing to go with, right? So there's a certain point in time where the convenience lens becomes more valuable to us, and we should apply it when we're making smaller purchases and put that cost lens on for the really big purchases of our lives, or perhaps the value lens. So being able to be adaptable and switch the lenses that we're using are what I'm talking about there. Some money dials, these are the things that really get us excited. So for me, I will say that one of my huge money dials is experiences. And like, maybe you could call it a little bit of travel, but for me, like, I have spent the last 10 years of my life really not traveling very much at all. I have been hyper focused on the experiences of exploring this state. Like, Colorado has a lot to offer. I love skiing, I love going to new places and checking them out. And so I have put a high value, like, skiing is a pain in the butt and it takes a lot of money. But I've put a high value on that in my life. And as a result, I've put a lower value on other things. Like, for example, luxury is not necessarily one of my money values. So for me, like, I know people who luxury is a money dial for them. And when they go out to hotels, like, they want to be at the nicest hotel. For me, like, that has just, it's not what gets me excited. And instead, I'd rather, sleep in the back of my car in order to be able to wake up really early in the morning and 5 degrees outside and go on a ski tour. So for me, that's kind of one of my money dials. For other people, luxury is a huge money dial. Self-improvement, health and fitness, all of these things. I know people who, on the self-improvement / health and fitness side of things, hire a personal trainer or a personal coach and make that part of their rich life because they highly value that health piece or that self-improvement piece. So we'll talk a little bit about that more, but really what I wanted to show you all is the numbers. So here's the, let me do a quick time check. Okay, cool. Here's the thing about the numbers is what I find is that across the board, everybody struggles with the numbers of finance. And the reason for that is because it's not just like this piece. I was a math teacher. Right. So like, I know a lot, I've heard a lot in my life, like, oh, I'm just not good at math, which is not true. Definitely not true. I have a whole lesson where I teach adults, I reteach adults how to multiply and divide. And it's pretty cool because basically what we do is we do it with manipulatives. And by the end of that lesson, I won't go into all the details of it, but by the end of the lesson, even adults who grew up just like me with times tables, I moved when I was in 2nd and 3rd grade. And so like, I missed a big portion of memorizing times tables. And I felt like I was bad at math until I got into high school and started being able to do a few other things. Whoa, like, I can actually do this. Well, the same thing happens where adults who have memorized times tables will all of a sudden start to play with these manipulatives, and they're like, I'm like, if you were to extrapolate this out and imagine yourself being a young kid again, and every time you did a multiplication problem, you were doing this, what do you think would happen? They're like, oh, like eventually I would get to the point where I get tired of making these little squares that you give me. Like if you're doing, 7 times 8 even, there's 56 of them that I have to put, that takes a long time and I get tired of doing that. And so I could see myself eventually getting to the point where I actually think about multiplication visually in a completely different way than I was taught. And the same thing happens with our numbers. The reason that I see, that I will say is a little bit more on the, like, I feel like that happens to creatives or to writers or to historians a little bit more. On the flip side, engineers, scientists, accountants, those are people who we typically think of as being math oriented. And they struggle with the numbers of finance. Oftentimes because engineers, especially, will over-engineer their spreadsheet to the point where there's so much going on with it, they're just like, oh, I don't even know how to keep track of all this. It's too much. And they get overwhelmed kind of for an opposite reason, but still the same result, right? And so this for me is where when we dive into the numbers, really what I'm trying to do is give us that view of the whole playing field. One more point here is we never get to see a menu of options, right? Like when it comes to budgeting, we don't really get to see, oh, like this person over here uses this particular method, and this person who's in the exact same financial situation, but they approach money from a different psychology, use a completely different system, and that works for them. Like we never get to see that and to pick and choose and take some of those options to apply them to our own lives. And so that's where, again, I really like to be able to provide some of those examples. Okay, last point before we jump truly into the numbers is this idea of cash flow. Cash flow is the lifeblood of our finances. And yet, when you think about it, like it's actually, there's a lot going on mathematically. So if we break everything down, the basic equation of finance is frustratingly simple. We have income coming in and expenses going out. So inputs and outputs. But also if you think about like mathematics and you go back to your, maybe high school or college days and you think about like that problem set where you have a bucket filled with water and there's water coming in at a certain rate and there's water going out at a certain rate. And then you start making the inputs go up and down month to month and the outputs go up and down month to month. And you're like, what's happening here? That's really hard math. That's differential equations. And I took a differential equations class in college. And I was overwhelmed the entire time I was in that class, right? So the math that's happening when we're talking about our cash flow is actually really complicated. And yet we often try to play by feel or to keep track of the numbers in our head. Or sometimes we try to keep track of them on a spreadsheet, but it's really, really difficult, tricky math to be able to do that. So what I like to use the analogy of is people do different sports, people play different instruments or are musicians of different types. Well, at the end of the day, like if I'm teaching somebody how to play basketball, I'm not going to start them off by teaching them how to do a through the leg spinning dribble. Right? I'm going to teach them the fundamentals. Like we're going to learn how to dribble the ball. We're actually going to learn how to dribble with your right hand. And then we're going to dribble with your left hand. And then we'll start crossing over. And then when you have the fundamentals dialed is when you can start to get loose with things. The same thing happens in playing an instrument, right? You learn how to play a particular note and then you can get creative with things. Same thing with skiing, right? You're not going to go off and start learning how to spin. You're going to learn how to turn first, put pressure on one of your edges first. And so that's really what we're trying to get at when we get into this idea of finances. There is a process where we're learning how to dribble the ball, but ultimately the goal is to be able to be in a place where we can get a little more loose with things, because that's where a lot of people want to get to. A lot of people do want to get to the place where it's like, hey, I actually don't have to worry about my finances. Like maybe I check in on them once a month for 1 hour a month, but I don't want to have it be this constant thing. So that's kind of how this system helps. And what we use to do this, or what I recommend people at least check out in this realm, is what I call the conscious cash flow plan. This idea is adapted from Ramit Sethi again. His book is called I Will Teach You to Be Rich, which is really funny because that name kept me from reading it for a long time. And then when I finally picked it up, I was like, this is an incredible book. There's a lot of incredible books out there, by the way. J.L. Collins is another financial guru who's fantastic. His book is called The Simple Path to Wealth. Farnoosh Torabi is another amazing financial guru. So there's lots of them out there that I think direct us in a really good direction. So happy to give more recommendations on that. But basically what we do with the Conscious Cash Flow Plan is we break things down into 4 categories. So this is essentially an adaptation of this really common financial principle called the 50-30-20 rule, which says 50% of your income should go towards your needs, 30% should go towards your wants, and 20% should go towards savings and debt repayment. This is an adaptation of that. So you'll see that there's a little bit more flexibility in the recommendations for some of these categories. So your needs would be your fixed costs. Fixed costs are your rent or mortgage, your auto payment, any debt repayment, childcare, pet supplies, things like that. The stuff that you pay for every single month, and it's generally the same. Groceries might fluctuate a little bit, gas might fluctuate a little bit, but I'm paying for that every month and it's generally the same. So if we go above 60% on our fixed costs, we are highly likely to feel more anxious or more stressed about our finances. It's just the dynamics of it. It's just how it works out. So this is actually how we generally will think about, am I living within my means or not? And if we're above 60% on our fixed costs, that's not a problem. I mean, for the long term, if we don't plan to do anything about it, it will continue to become a bigger and bigger problem. But for right now, if people begin to do some of this and they realize, like, wow, I'm at 75% on fixed costs, there are so many things that we can begin to do to alleviate that issue. But they oftentimes are like, oh, well, no wonder I'm feeling stressed about the way things are working for me right now. Savings recommend between 5 and 10% of take-home pay. I like to bucket savings based on having certain goals, and the difference between savings and investments is just the short term versus the long term. Investments, shoot for about 10% of take-home pay. That's the long-term stuff. Investments should be boring, and they should be automatic every single month so that we don't even have to think about it. We don't have to question ourselves whether the stock market is up or down and I'm going to try to buy low and sell high. It's like that is, first of all, very stressful. It takes a lot of your time. And the statistics on it are that we don't get it correct anyway. There are professionals out there who are tracking that every single day. And the studies out there say that even they don't track the market as well as just investing in a standard total market index fund. That's dynamics though that we can dive into more later on if people are curious about it. And then the last category, and this is where I think things start to get fun, is the guilt-free spending category. And this is where I think we really start to get to that idea of how do you make money joyful? And this is how too many of us feel guilty when we go and we buy something. But this guilt-free spending category, what it does is it essentially tells us this is how much I get every month to live the life I want to live, to do the things that I enjoy doing. This is the stuff that I don't have to feel guilty about because I have thought intentionally about what I value with the amount that I have per month, and I'm applying it towards that. So this is that way to be able to live for the now and also for the long term, to balance those two as effectively as possible. So one thing I will say about fixed costs is calculating your fixed costs turns out to be one of the hardest problems in personal finance. The reason for that is because, theoretically, if you want to figure out how much do I spend on gas every month or groceries every month, what most people will tell you to do is go and pull 6 months of your spending statements, whether that's on a credit card or debit card, whichever card you use. So if you use multiple cards, you need to pull multiple statements from the last 6 months, go through with a highlighter and start adding up and categorizing different categories for yourself, right? Which that can be a big commitment. That can take a lot of time. And so we live in 2024. We have tools that can help us to do that. For some people, it's worth doing that at least one time because it really helps us to see the ground level. But for other people, like myself included, I would just give up trying to do that. And so instead, oh wow, I didn't know it was going to play. So I'm not going to necessarily go through all of that. Basically, that video shows what I'll say about it is when I first joined a very small credit union, my perception was totally wrong. I was like, oh, small credit union, they won't have an app that's very good. Like, there will be other resources out there that'll be a little bit better for me. Our app is amazing. And so I will often, for our members at least, there's a little bit of explanation necessary, and that's a kind of an overview of what I did in that video. But I will guide them through how to most efficiently go back and pull statements to be able to average, like, oh, okay, here's how much I'm spending on gas every month. And you can get into a little bit more specifics if people are curious about it. But overall, I used to use a different app. There's a bunch of kind of financial tracker apps out there available, whether they're, I won't say more about them. I used to use some different ones, and I've gotten to the point where the OnTap app is my only app that I use at this point. It's you can link even external cards if you have external credit cards or bank accounts or anything like that. So it makes it a really nice kind of just one-stop hub for me where I can see everything in one place. I'm very impressed with it overall. I talked about recommending different savings buckets. Investing should be boring. One thing that is funny is I always tell people, you subscribe to your savings. Like, you know how that Netflix $20 a month just goes out without even knowing? So I just log into the Netflix and do the same thing with your savings. So you don't even see it going into that account every month. You log in 2 years later. Wow, sweet. But the last thing here is, I don't know why we do this, but we compartmentalize. You ask an average person out there, how much do you have in investments? And they're like, oh, however much they save. And maybe they're like, oh, I don't have anything invested. And you're like, well, do you have a 401k? And they're like, oh, yeah. Well, that's an investment. those are great investments, tax advantaged investments. So 401ks, Roth IRAs, HSAs, all of that stuff are investments as well. And there's this thing known as the investment ladder, which is a great thing to be starting to solve. Okay, here's what I want to show you is this conscious cash flow plan a little bit more in depth. I'm going to switch this out real quick just to show you an overview of kind of how this works. I'm going to exit here and show you right on this. Okay, so this is the conscious cash flow system. You'll see that I have a bunch of little notes in here. Oftentimes when people first go in to fill this out, nobody gets the conscious cash flow plan correct the first time. By the way, there is no correct. But it is meant to literally just be a 30,000-foot view of your finances in general, and it does not have to be specific. It doesn't have to be down to the decimal point. Things can be totally estimated. Part of the value of it is that we can begin just playing with the numbers, and we can get a good view of, wow, what would happen if I did this or did that change in my life? So I've made up a fictional person here. This person is on the younger end of the spectrum. So they currently make $6,000 a month gross. So they make about 70K a year. This is a single person in my imaginary scenario. And so as a result, I'm thinking of this person as being a little bit earlier in their life. Let's say that they have a car that is valued at $30,000. So that's their main asset that they have listed. They have some investments through a 401k. So they've listed those. They have some savings, and they also have some debt. I haven't even specified if that's student debt or if that's credit card debt, what it is. But in this case, this person's net worth is a little bit negative, especially for folks younger in their lives. That is totally fine. That's why we set up this system. And the most powerful thing that you can do in your finances moving forward is to create a consistent monthly change. Too often we think that I'm a little bit low here. I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to sell my car and I'm going to take those funds and pay down some debt. That's great. But to make a consistent monthly change is what really amplifies things. So in this case, the beginning here, this whole net worth section is just to be a little bit of an overview. How does it make people feel? ultimately, this is where we get into the real numbers. Like I said, fixed costs are really challenging to calculate, but I've made up some numbers for this person in this case. And so in this scenario, we have all of this stuff. We have their utilities, insurance, their debt payments, things like that. So in my scenario here, again, made up, but one thing I will note is we have a section that the miscellaneous section automatically adds 15% to the end for things that you forgot, because I don't know about you, I will forget things. And then what you'll see here is that this person's at 67% of their fixed costs at the moment. What are the recommendations?
50 to 60.
50 to 60. So they're a little bit high. I'm guessing that this person may be feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit stressed about the way things are going. And yet at the same time, check this out. This person's actually still contributing the recommended amount to investments, 10%. So in the 10% column, they have some going to a 401k. That's pre-tax, but still I include it down there because things can get a little complicated. If people want to go into the real dynamics of like, how do you calculate the pre-tax stuff like that, we can do that. But it shows you what your percentage is based on net income. So this person's at 10%. They're also contributing to a Roth IRA, which is another great tax advantage investment account. They also have some savings goals. So in my scenario here, this person has decided for whatever reason, and by the way, you'll see that their savings are at almost 4 months of reserve income. So what that means is if that person completely lost a job, didn't have income coming in anymore, they can make it for almost 4 months with their savings before they had to find what was next. General recommendations on personal finance side of things is to try to have 6 months reserve savings. If you can put that in a high yield savings account, but do that. But this person, a little bit low. So I would actually go in and I'd recommend, hey, this is cool. Like you're putting a good amount of money towards a vacation fund and towards your auto repair fund. That's awesome. But let's put a little bit more into that long-term emergency reserves. Let's get you to 6 months first, and then we can start thinking about that vacation fund a little bit later on, things like that, right? Because how does it feel to know that if you were to have the worst case scenario happen, zero income coming in anymore, you'd at least have a full 6 months to figure out what's next, right? Like that feeling of security, I think is worth a lot. And then we can get to the vacation after that, right? Auto repair fund, this is awesome, right? Because too many people play defense with our money. We're like, I know something's gonna happen with my car at some point, and yet I try to figure out where the money's gonna come from when it does actually happen, versus being proactive, playing offense with my money. And instead of waiting for something to happen, I'm like, yeah, cool. Like I needed a repair. It really stinks that it was $1,500 for this car repair, but it's right here. I'm going to just draw it from this auto reserve fund. And then what you'll see here is this person ends up with a guilt-free spending number of 18%. So overall, this actually isn't too bad. Like at the end of the day, this person is a little bit below the guilt-free spending recommendations, but at the same time, 18%, especially for somebody who's pretty young and living in, like what looks like a pretty nice house, let's say, for where they're at, has some somewhat high expenses in some realms. So that 18% means that at the end of the day, they get almost $850 that they get to do what they want with every single month. And if they have a big purchase that they want to, let that be saved up for a little bit, they can choose to do that. If they're somebody who is in this idea of the FIRE community, has anybody heard of that? The FIRE community? The FIRE community is the financial independence retire early. So this is one of those areas where people get really into retiring early. And sometimes, again, psychologically, you get so focused on how much you're putting away and you don't buy anything. You embrace your frugalism, which is awesome. Like if you can do that, there are elements of it that are amazing, but you can sometimes get so into the saving component of it and the putting stuff away that if they want to, I can say like, well, I have 18%, I have $850 a month. I'm going to put another 500 of those towards my long term because I'm that frugal. I'm only going to have a little bit. But at some point, a lot of those people also get to the point where they're like, what's the point of this? Like, I'm not living my life, like Is it all for when I'm, 65 or 60 or whatever the case is? And if I even make it that far, like, why don't I live a little now too, right? And then they can adjust their percentages a bit. Okay, so here's the power of this, is that when we start to go in and make some changes and adjust some things, we start talking about like, well, okay, every single component of this, right? Like, let's talk about the rent or mortgage. Well, in my scenario here, this is a young person, pretty good salary overall. They're paying $1,500 a month for their rent. Could you lower that cost at all? Would that be worth it? What would that start to feel like? It's like, well, what are some ways that you could lower your housing costs? What are some ways this person could lower their housing costs? Roommate, yeah. I was thinking somebody would say like, well, you could just move to a cheaper place. But yeah, I mean, especially if you're young, like, would you be open to having a roommate? Like, would that increase your quality of life? Well, what would happen if you did get a roommate? What if you only charge them, let's say, you're paying $1,500 a month. What if you charge a roommate $600 a month, something like that? So then you're paying $900. Dang, your fixed cost just dropped to 52%. Well, what does that mean? Well, you already had your savings goals at 10% and, your investments at 10, savings at 5. Check this out. You have $1,500 a month now to do what you want with. Well, you didn't actually do that, right? Like, so we're just talking theoreticals here. How would you feel about living with a roommate, but having $1,500 a month to do whatever you wanted with, to live your life? Like, for some people, what's your money dial? If your money dial is your home and you work from home and you love being in your house and all of that, then like, put the money towards the house and you can live, on the guilt-free spending side of things. You're gonna have a little bit less money, but if you're somebody who's like, if you're like, I sleep at my house and that's it. And other than that, I go into the office and then I'm out with friends. And what do you think? Like, could you get a roommate? Could you, have? And so that's kind of how you can begin some of these decisions. I'm going to kind of end it there. I'm sure we're going to come back to this. Last thing that I'll say on this front is just a little bit of info about this piece. This is kind of my overall philosophy. I like to just talk to people and figure out, I don't like to prescribe. If people ultimately don't like the idea of the guilt-free the conscious cash flow plan, fine. But can you create a system that will resonate with you? And just kind of talking through all of this stuff. So it's a fun process on the coaching side of things, and I think a unique value that we're able to add in that regard. And then I hope that there are some questions and we can dive into them from there. We have, let's see here, 49. What comes up for you all?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
So I watched the Netflix series Get Smart with Your Money.
Okay.
It aired in 2022, and I really liked it because financial advisors come in and they share tips, and then they feature like a case study, different families and different family dynamics. So when you were talking about the menu, how can I apply this? How does that fit? There was a scenario in here that I resonate. And then I was like, oh, I like the dynamic of the advisor plus the scenario, how they went on to approaching turning things around. And then also hearing and seeing where people come from at like the depths of the lows, and then because they're on a TV show for a reason, and then they overcome that. And so seeing success stories is nice too, because people don't openly share about money. Well, you don't know, you don't have options. And so I like being in the discussion and then being able to observe. And just a comment, I really found that a beneficial series to watch.
100%. Yeah. Seeing them. One of the things that does make me think of that I didn't mention about is, for me, I'm always trying to figure out how do we keep our systems as simple as possible, automate as much as possible so that we don't have to go in and do every single piece ourselves. Trying to leave it to our own emotions is a recipe for not getting things right. And so what happens often with the guilt-free spending numbers, people will say, well, like, that's still all mixed in with the rest of my, like, how do I actually track that, right? How do I make sure that I'm hitting that number? And this is that dribbling of the ball. This is the learning of the fundamentals first. The way that I recommend people do that is have 2 different spending accounts. I don't like to call them spending accounts. I like to call them cash flow accounts. You can tell cash. It's all about cash flow for me, right? So I use 2 different cash flow accounts. And one cash flow account is your fixed cost. That's where your paycheck comes into every single month. And then from there, you have it automatically disperse your investment and saving funds. So your investments, 401k, maybe it's a Roth IRA, whatever it is that you have investments, your saving funds, that's your long-term emergency, your vacation fund, whatever it is. And then your guilt-free spending number, that $842 a month, or if we changed it to the $1,500, whatever it is, that goes automatically to your other cash flow account. And for us, we have set up our accounts to where you can go in on the app and just yourself rename the account. So my accounts are called my cash flow account and then my guilt-free spending account. That's what I name them so that I know which one's which. When I see what's in my guilt-free spending account, like I've gotten to the point where I kind of know where I'm at month to month, right? But there are times where it's the 20th of the month and I'm just like, where am I at? I'm at the point where I'm a little bit loose with things, right? But then I'm like, let me see where I'm at. Log into my app. Okay, here's where my guilt-free spending is at. I have another $300 to go this month. I wanted to go on an extra long ski trip, or or whatever it is, right? I wanted to buy a new pair of boots. I'm just gonna leave, I'm done with my guilt-free spending this month. I'm gonna leave that in there, let it build up for next month. And I have another $1,500 coming in, or $800 or whatever it is. Okay, cool, that's gonna be my purchase. So that means that I do have to not go out. I do have to say no more times to my friends who want to go have beers at Mountain Toad or wherever. So that's kind of how you're able to separate things in a way that keeps it clean. You don't have to go in and do all this micro tracking. And there's a lot of ways to set that up. Of course, there's some people who like to spend on credit cards rather than on debit cards. I do that myself. And so we get into the dynamics of like, well, how do you want to set it up? Like you can have your one credit card be only your guilt-free spending card. That's probably your card that has a lower limit on it. A lot of people will have one with higher limit, things like that. What else came up? Do you all think that you could implement a system like this or try a system like this out and see positive effects, positive benefits from it? What do you think for young people?
It helps create habits if they see the reward in it. And I think you were talking earlier about, like a student, when I started learning best in school was when I took on my learning for myself.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true for finances, and I like that you. And I think that you can encourage kids to take on money for themselves.
Like you mentioned, for me, I think I need to print on start implementing an automated process.
Yeah, we should link up. I can help you do that.
I'm curious how entrepreneurship factors in.
Entrepreneurship is hard because it's variable income, right? And it can be up and down each month. There are several techniques that are really great to implement for entrepreneurs, but at the end of the day, the key part of it is percentage based. So it's like, hey, every single paycheck, you can set it up, and you have to go into the back end of systems and things like that, but you can set it up so it's like, hey, every single paycheck, I have 5% going to this, and so the percent based is huge. And then the other thing for entrepreneurs, especially, is those reserve funds become a lot bigger of a deal. Like I personally have been an entrepreneur, solopreneur, I should say, with highly variable income, and I wanted always 12 months reserves instead of 6 months reserves. Like a small change like that made me feel a lot better. But basically, without going too far into the dynamics of it, what you do is you put a number for your guaranteed income. Like this is, I make this every single month, 4,000. Some months I make 15,000. I'm not gonna put 15,000 in my calculations, right? And so I'm going to put what the guaranteed is, and then it's kind of creating that reserves and finding the right balance for where you want to be. But that's kind of like the real short version of it. It's tough. Entrepreneurship makes it harder. The other thing that happens is a lot of entrepreneurs wonder about the investment and savings side of things, or young people too. Like there's a lot of folks that they're not. There's no savings, no investment, and I'm not saying that that's like fine for the long term. Like I am betting that you have goals for the rest of your life. That's the thing that you want. But like if this is the first time that you're jumping in and engaging with your money, or if you're an entrepreneur that is earlier on and your income is highly variable oriented, like cut those out for a while. Like that'll be fine. And we can put that on the goal for the longer term down the road. That happens also with folks with debt. Sometimes people, even if they have a good amount of debt, are really focused on still making those 401k contributions. And we can go in and start to highlight, I don't want to do like all the math of it, but you can start playing with some of the calculators and say like, well, what would happen if I put this amount per month into, you know, whatever it is, an investment of some type, a low cost market index fund versus paying down this debt that's at 29% interest. Like, oh my goodness, like my debt is an emergency. I am putting everything toward that first. We can get to the investments later. I have time to do those after we get down the debt first. But also like it's highly personalized too. Like at the end of the day, people have to have a reason to care, to do that and set that plan. What were you thinking, Chris?
Well, I have two thoughts. One, my spouse is not sitting here, right? So I get to go home and eat it too. But so Martin knows this because I have two college kids, one's about to graduate hopefully in June. And so it's a whole idea about this budgeting stuff. So I guess as I graduate, try to go to Marshall. But when I'm sure you guys were talking, I have one kid that is motivated by money, has already had a lot of money in savings, figured out investing. And another kid who is like all about convenience.
Yeah.
You know, all of them goes to DoorDash. It's like, right, but that's good. There's a similarity between their kids, and so then the big thing about this is, you know, with your spouse, the partner, you know, that this process is super challenging. So any secret? Any tips?
I think it's interesting because like on a real level, the conversations that I get to have with couples are like really fun because it increases the complexity when you have two people that you're talking to, right? There's more emotions, there's more brains, but at the same time, I think sometimes we have so many perceptions that get kind of down one single track that some of those questions I was alluding to earlier are like really cool to have people start to